Welcome to Sparks of History, where Jewish history and world history meet. We are extremely honored and pleased to have with us today Jonathan Yonason Rosenblum. Jonathan Rosenblum is an acclaimed journalist, author, and speaker. He received his bachelor's, his BA from the University of Chicago, earned a law degree from Yale University Law School, and graduated, among other places, from Or Sameach's main branch in Jerusalem. Right.
I spent 10 years by Rav Kushelevsky
Okay.
at Mir Yeshiva.
Since 1989, Rabbi Yonason has been a columnist in nearly every major Anglo-Orthodox publication, including, at present, a featured columnist for the popular Mishpacha Magazine. His numerous books include biographies on Rav Kamenetsky, Mike Tress, Rav Eliyahu Dessler, Rabbi Shraga Feivel Mendlowitz, Rabbi Mosher Sherer, Rabbi Noach Weinberg, Rabbi Meyar Shuster, Lieutenant Mayor Birnbaum. He has also adapted into English books called Making Sense of Suffering and Breaking Through, relating to struggling teens. And the more recent, which we will be discussing among other topics, Ordinary Greatness and Some Extraordinary, 100 Songs of Praise, a wonderful collection of essays, which the family has been enjoying for the last number of weeks since we purchased it, and urge all our listeners and viewers to either go online or go to your local bookstore. It's just really a wonderful collection of essays by Yonason. Getting started with Ordinary Greatness, and of course we'll go on to some other topics. What do you mean by greatness in the title, and what do you mean by ordinary in this context?
Well, by greatness, I basically mean almost any trait that a particular person exemplifies that we can learn from, something that's worthy of emulation, something that stands out about a person that basically that we can learn from. I always tell my kids, and I say that this book is in some sense my tzavah, my ethical will to my children, meaning the message is pay attention to everybody that you meet. Look for what's special about them. Look for what you can learn from them, and then incorporate it into your lives. I think everybody here, every piece has been structured in such a way that it's what is unique about that person and what stands out comes out. I mean, some of them are not people who are very much like me. I just met the wife of one of my subjects, the widow, unfortunately, of one of my subjects last night in a local store. And I told her, I sat behind your husband in shul for years and years, but I never talked to him because I saw he always had something to do. He didn't have time for schmoozing, and I didn't feel like I wanted to take up his time. But you can learn a lot about a person by watching him from 2 rows behind and seeing how he interacts with his children. And I saw that he was a special person. So that's what I mean by greatness, somebody from whom we can learn. By ordinary, I simply mean that they're, in most cases, the ones that there are people whom I didn't, who are not generally known to a broader public. I mean, they weren't famous. They weren't the kind of people who have biographies written about them. If you look on the flap cover, I have a quotation from George Eliot's great novel Middlemarch. And the heroine of Middlemarch, Dorothea Brooke, I think is her name. I haven't read it since I was probably almost 50 years ago. But at the beginning of the book, she's filled with all kinds of great dreams of the amazing things that she's going to do with her life. She's filled with energy. And in the end, none of those things come to fruition. But George Eliot says, there are a lot of people who, had they not lived in the world, things would not be as good with you and me as they have been, who have had this influence on the sviva around them, on everything around them, and it's diffusive. I think she uses some term like diffusive, that it spreads out. They create ripples of goodness. They produce good children. Those children produce good children. They affect the course of history. I think what's her line here? I think it's a nice line that people who live faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. So they're not world famous, but that the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been, is half owing to the number who live faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. Now, of course, most of the people I write about don't live in unvisited tombs because they're greatly beloved by their families and many cases have very large families. But that's the general point, ordinary in the sense of not being world famous. There are plenty of famous people in the book as well, but
how does a person develop the trait? We're not all of us are writers. Most people aren't writers. So you're able to observe and to write. But how does a person come to observe and appreciate the way you look at it and appreciate the people that you're writing about? Well, what's required to get to that point?
well, part of that is, I never thought I'd become a writer. I thought I would, most of my early life, I thought I'd become a lawyer and then president of the United States. I mean, this is somewhat of a different shift. I didn't start writing. I wrote one letter to the editor in high school, one letter to the editor in college, and then I did write an article in the Yale Law Journal, but it was so boring that I don't think anybody would read that. Let's put it this way. I think you have to be interested in people, which means you have to be a pretty good listener too. I always say if I get on a transatlantic flight and I'm sitting next to somebody and I don't have an article to write about them when the trip is over, then I feel like I must have been a failure. If you can't bring out something, get people to talk to you and generally be interested in them. I mean, I'll tell you, my own children, I used to say to them when they were in Shidduchim, I have 7 sons and 1 daughter, so I'm mostly talking about the sons. I would tell them, oh, I know this family. I know, not only do I know the parents of the girl that's mentioned here, I know the grandparents and the great-grandparents. And even so, they were not interested in my opinion whatsoever. And then sometimes they would say, oh, wait, a friend of mine in yeshiva has a sister who was a friend of hers in high school, and all of a sudden that trumps all my knowledge. So I always ask my kids, why doesn't my opinion or what I have to offer of any use to them? They said, but you like everybody, so your research is not your research is not believable because you like everybody. Okay.
So
you have to like people.
You have to like people. So is this coming off of the whole idea of love, a hafta l'recha kamocha, of it? The source is that you look at fellow Jews and even non-Jews, and you say, there's something to love in that person, and you can find something to love in almost everybody. Is that the core?
I think that's true, and I do find. I often look around. I recently had an experience on a Shabbos morning, I think, of looking around the shul and just thinking there was something special about everybody there and how much I admired something about everybody in the shul. But I was always a people person. I was always somewhat, I guess. I mean, I think of myself as having been a shy kindergarten student, but and I never could sort of introduce myself and start conversations, but I could finish them once they got started. If I had any entree, carrying on a conversation was never something that was difficult for me. So this precedes, the tshuva experience of my wife and myself. It's not something that, and I was very interested in literature. I used to read hundreds of novels. I mean, the fact that I cite Middlemarch here, somebody laughed and they said, what are you citing Middlemarch on the flap of a book that might be aimed, is almost aimed at the religious world. This book wasn't meant to be aimed at the religious world. We could talk about that, but in any event, they said you might have to explain to your readers that George Eliot was a woman. But yeah, I find that a lot of people make the mistake of underestimating our world in terms of its reading ability. That's not true. I don't feel, I try never to write down I never write down in the sense that I'm writing for a firm audience, not at all. In terms of the arguments I use, the things I cite, they may not be familiar with a particular book, but nobody's familiar with everything that any columnist cites.
And so what was the goal, in addition to the legacy to your children and grandchildren? What was the goal and purpose of putting this collection together in one? And you call it 100 Songs of Praise, which is an interesting subtitle.
Well, listen, the idea for the book didn't come from me. I've always wanted to do this because I have, 2,500 columns lying around, which I'd like to see in some more permanent form, and many of which I like very much and I think are sufficiently timeless they could be put together. But somebody came to me, he had already selected most of the pieces for this book. I've sort of been embarrassed when I found a couple that aren't there. And I had written to people that, I wrote the piece I wrote about your father, and he did this. And then I look and I see it's not there, which has been something of a shock to me. He came to me. He had an idea. He was interested in going into book publishing. It was just something that he thought might be interesting. We had met before. We were somewhat friendly. And he also wanted this book to be a kiruv tool. He said, look, you write like a Yale Law School graduate, for better or worse. Let's say I'm really I have more affinities to the University of Chicago, but you write at a level, you have a fairly broad knowledge of the world. Let them see, and that's why I use the name Jonathan, so that it wouldn't be off-putting to a non-religious reader. Let them introduce them to our world, to people in our world. You can show them a certain sense of worldly sophistication, the articles on Abraham Lincoln and George Washington and Margaret Thatcher, the interviews, let them see that you can be a frum Jew and not uninvolved in the world or detached from the world. It's interesting, the person, just before we started talking, I had over a young man who's learning at Mechon Yaakov here. But he was for 10 years a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. And we were put together as learning partners when he was still in America. And he told me recently, he said, one of the reasons I was able to come here and make this decision to come to yeshiva for a year was because you showed me that becoming religious doesn't mean cutting yourself off from every other interest that you ever had. And I think that was meant to be one of the subliminal messages of the book.
And have you gotten response from people that that you don't know, that have said, "Well, I've read these stories and it's inspiring. It's it's just."
I have not met anybody who doesn't love the book. I mean, okay. I'm madly in love with the book too. I mean, they were most of these pieces were among great favorites of mine as well, because I like writing about people. I've written, that's why I, sort of moved easily into the role of a biographer. I like writing about people, and I like putting them in their historical context because, I was a history major in my time. But I have never met anybody who didn't love the book. But I haven't. On the other hand, I have no indication that it has gotten out to the broader non-Jewish world. To do that, you really, I'm not good. I would never put the book together myself. And even after he picked all the articles, it still took me another 5 years to do everything that necessary to publishing it. So in that sense, I haven't succeeded. What I did do is offer it to the Maimonides programs there's an organization called Meyar, which is an on-campus Kiruv organization on 20 campuses. And I offer them at a radically discounted price to use it as a prize for those who finish a semester in the Maimonides program, which is a particular learning format, or even for rabbis who are learning one-on-one with people to give it to them as a present, because the book is accessible. I think the glossary alone might be about 50 pages, so that no one should ever not be able to understand anything in there because they think they're reading a book of inside baseball. As my father would have put it, it's easier than reading one of the Russian novels where it takes you 50 pages to get the names straight. So.
Absolutely. One of the themes in the book is gratitude, hakarat hatov. Why is gratitude so important? How far does it? We know that it sometimes extends not just to people, but to inanimate objects in Torah learning. And why is it so important? And how do you build that in a person? How does a person build gratitude, especially for things that happened many, many, many years ago?
I just want to read you something. I think it came in I had it at What's Up Today. One of the things I subscribe to or get. Anyhow, it mentioned today scientific studies that gratitude is very good for your mental health, good for your perspective on life, that the more we develop this quality, how beneficial it is to us. It's also true of a lot of the things we consider good midos. I think I wrote a column recently about the research on smiling, that when you smile, you release endorphins, you release all kinds of hormones which are associated with mood elevation. So I think it's something we should all work on. I mean, what do we get up in the morning and we start our day with modeh ani, thank you, thank you, and then to make that meaningful, try to think about all the things that make your life meaningful. If you've been blessed with a wonderful wife who you've built a life together and had a family together. I mean, I think she's the most frequent beneficiary of my expressions of gratitude in the book. On the columns written on turning 50, on turning 60, on turning 70, always end with my wife. You make one good decision in life and everything else can somehow follow from that.
Those are articles on your ages, not hers.
Not hers. We're
Okay.
not so far apart. And but there is an article on my high school English teacher in the AP English my senior year in my Harvard essay. She flunked me and covered it with red markings. I thought, wow, it was such a brilliant piece on the Gore Vidal William Buckley debates in the 1968 and the TV coverage of the 1968 conventions, and she made it. I was lucky. I wasn't of that generation where now if you don't get an A, your parents come to school and complain to the teacher and threaten to bring a lawsuit for having broken their child.
Well, there's post-traumatic stress from that.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I remember very well, and I have been in touch recently with this professor from my freshman year in college. Well, I had a dream about him, and since he's a pretty famous professor, I looked him up and I found him and wrote to him after a space. I mean, we were close. I once house sat for him during the summer in Hyde Park. I mean, we were close, but it's been a long, long, long time. And I had a dream about him, and I sent him a letter saying, I dreamed about you last night, and I think you might be interested in. I remember very well that you once told us, and I was in a literature class with him my first semester at the University of Chicago. And he once told me there are only two people who could write in this class. And one of them was my closest friend, who really could write. Another was a young woman who I think returned home, was homesick from Montana, He said, I still remember their names, Robert Gombiner and Teresa Alcott, they can write. So I noted that one of those names wasn't Jonathan Rosenblum. But, what I learned from it, I felt that they wanted to tell me you could get better. And I don't know if I ever became a very good writer in college, but I wrote lots of 100-page I wrote papers, huge papers. But the idea that you could get better, that there's what to learn, and that it's not some fairy dust that are sprinkled on a person. It's a skill, and skills have to be developed. First of all, you have to read a lot. That's true, and appreciate good writing, but which I always did. But I have a tremendous amount of gratitude to them because I think they built me up in special ways. Of course, the biggest debt of gratitude is to my parents, and that's why the book starts with appreciations of my mother and my father and my mother, and my youngest brother who passed away can't say. He wouldn't have said prematurely. He would have said he became religious as well. And I once asked him if he was angry that it took so long for them to get results when he took his first blood test for what turned out to be lymphoma. And he said, whatever happened, that's the way Hashem wanted it to work out. And this was somebody who had 6 children at the time. He had graduated second in his class at Yale. He had a lot to live for and a lot to contribute. But he might have also said, because he died young, in terms of looking at the positive side, a posthumous book of his writing and his letters to students was published. It would not have been published. He never would have put it together if he hadn't been for the fact that his time was limited. And then a lot of students pushed him to put things that were on his computer that he had sent them into writing. And so his premature passing, or his early passing, let's say, was a cause for getting many of his ideas out to a broader world.
Okay. Moving to the topic of biographies and Gedolim Torah giants, what is Yonason, your general approach when you write these biographies? How do you tackle the life of somebody who was a Torah giant, had tremendous scholarship, tremendous attributes? What's the approach?
Well, first of all, you have to understand, my first book was Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. And it's interesting, when I wrote that book, it took me 9 months. Now it could take me 9 years to write a book. I don't have the same focus that I had at that time. And that was, many people will tell you it's my best, but I have an introduction there where I set out what I think are the rules of writing about a gadol. And I'm amazed when I look back at it, how much of what is set out there has really turned out to be true. You mentioned scholarship. Scholarship's a problem because you're not writing a book about their Torah chidushim.
Right.
And in most cases, if you're writing about a gadol, they've been published or they will be published. And since I am not a great Torah scholar myself, I'm Yodea safer, but that's, I wouldn't say more than that. I said, that's not the most important part about this gadol is going to be something that's not going to be discussed in this book. There are certain people who are harder than others because some people were so internalized. I mean, I was asked to write a biography of Rav Mosher Shapiro, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha. My friend Menachem Nissel wrote a memoir. There was still room for a full biography, but he wrote a memoir called Looking into the Sun. And I think that was a great title because it meant, just like you can't look into the sun, you can only know the sun by virtue of the heat that it generates or the light that it generates from its, from the rays that go out from the sun, but looking directly into the sun. With Rav Moshe Shapiro, you have no chance of accessing his internal world. He would say to somebody who might sit next to him on a bus, person would say, hey, sit down and see. He's sitting next to Rav Moshe Shapiro and said, tell me a chiddush. And Rav Moshe would stare at him and his eyes could really turn you into a bag of bones immediately. He'd say, silence is also an option. And because he was an internal person, he was, he had a tremendous effect on so many and so many different groups. And the biography I would have written, maybe I still will, would have been on the different groups that he affected. Young Balei Tshuva in Russia, or not even Balei Tshuva yet, Israelis that came through Or Sameach that he had an impact on, the group of Talmidei Chachamim, Rosh Yeshivas like Rav David Cohen of Hebron, who came to his shirim. They were all different. He had impact on every one of these these groups in very different ways, and I can identify about 8 or 9 such groups. But you have to know that the Gedolim they're very different. If you can't bring out what made them different and unique, I'll just give you one little example.
Please.
I was writing a long article for Jewish Observer on Rav Yehuda Zev Segel, the Manchester Rosh Hashiva. So one of his grandsons told me a story about that in his very later years, the grandson had showed him something about how he put on a tallis, and explained that he had seen in some sefer this is a way to put on a tallis. And Rav Segel was very excited about this and started putting on his tallis in that fashion. Now, because that was his emotional makeup, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, I'm thinking, because, during the 9 months that I was working on his biography, I thought about him all the time. I thought about him in the shower. I thought about him everywhere. Wherever I was thinking, what would Rabbi Yaakov have thought about this or done or said? In his personality, in the Litvische Slobodka Talmud, I think he would have felt that was appalling. Why didn't you figure out how to put on a tallis when you got married? In other words, you worked out. You have to work it out. And I'm not saying one is better or worse. They're different. They're just different. If Rav Shraga Feivel Mendlowitz, somebody once said to him, you're not a man of this century, and he said, yes, I'm a person of the 21st century. Or he was a visionary. He was always thinking about what the next step would be. He put the spark in. He created Torah Vadas. He created the first major yeshiva probably in America. Had Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky been there instead of him, none of that would have happened. He wasn't that wasn't his strength. You see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu works it out to bring people in the right time. But a Rav Shraga Feivel Mendlowitz couldn't have given the direction and solidity to a much larger community that developed in Rabbi Yaakov's lifetime. It needed something different. It needed that patient, cool, analytical style that was his, not the fire of a Hungarian chassid, which is, he was high intellectual. Rav Shraga Feivel taught every sefer in the whole panoply of Jewish thought. But I'm saying they were different. And Mike Tress was able to inspire a movement and create a movement. He had never learned in yeshivas in his life. And he knew the names of the Gedolim, and he could say them with such passion that he brought them alive, the Gedolim in Europe. And he could say the word Chaverim to a group of 9, 10, 11-year-old kids in a Motzei Shabbos in a little shul attic in Williamsburg and bring them to life. But when Agudas Israel and the community became larger and it had to deal with political issues, it had to deal with lawyers, it had to deal with things like using urban renewal to save the borough park, you needed something with the organizational skills of his first cousin, 10 years his junior, Mosher Sherer. And each one, neither one of them could have done what the other did. They were just different. They had different skills and different strengths. But you see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu worked out in some way that each one would be in his proper period in Jewish history.
When you look at the Torah giants, the Gedolim, with all the differences and all the nuances, what common traits have you found among the Gedolim that you've written about?
I think the most obvious, the one that sticks out most, is an obsession with Kiddush Hashem, of what the image of a Torah Jew that you portray to the world in every action. Each one of them were absolutely focused on this. I mean, I have a speech on this, giving stories about Rav Dessler, and he would do something with somebody who was making a sash in a rented apartment, and then he would tell the 13-year-old student, who went on to become Rav Mordechai Miller, the longtime principal of Gateshead Seminary, what he had done and what was the conversation about and what message he had been trying to convey. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, Rav Shimon Schwab, every one of them, just a real obsession with the image of a frum Jew, like Rav Yaakov in a doctor's office, taking a ball out of his pocket to play with a 5-year-old boy there, just saying that, he may never see a Jew with a long beard again. I want his impression to be a good one. Or smiling at the nuns that he would pass on his walks in Muncie, and they're saying that they, writing a letter to local Jewish paper, talking about what it meant to them that this old rabbi smiled at them every time he passed them on his walk. What's less reported is that they said no one else smiled at us. But this was a fundamental to almost every one of the figures. Rav Shraga, Feivel, Mendlowitz telling boys during World War II who might have had a divinity student deferment, not to be seen on the streets of, even in rural Muncie. Don't do anything that might incite people to not like you or to think less of the Torah or think less of Torah Jews. This is just something that they thought about all the time and in so many ways.
Okay. As you look at the situation today, post last Simchas Torah, October 7th, certainly by nature you are a optimistic person. That there's an optimism that comes out. Are you still optimistic about the Jewish people in Israel, in the diaspora?
Well, that hasn't been one of the subjects of my optimism for a long time. I wrote in Commentary Magazine a piece on that American Jewry's entered a demographic death cycle. I mean, it's hard to see how it could possibly come out of that. But I've seen a lot of good things. I work closely with an organization called Kesher UD, which has been in Shabbatons with both the Nova survivors and also with families of hostages. And I've seen that we can relate to each other, that there are amazing things happening in the world now, dafka, because in the wake of October 7th, of people discovering they want to identify as Jews. In the face of anti-Semitism, they want to identify as Jews. On college campuses, you hear students saying things like, if they hate us so much, there must be a lot more to Judaism than lox and bagels. That can't be the source of that hatred. Why do they hate us so much? Anti-Semitism. I used to have a speech that I gave on college campuses called Anti-Semitism and Optimist View. And basically the point was that they hate us because they sense that we're the chosen people. I mean, there's a nice quote in Robert Wistrich's book. He was the great student of anti-Semitism, modern student of anti-Semitism, and he had a book called The Lethal Obsession. And he quotes a Jacques Maritain, who is a Catholic theologian from the 1920s or not, saying that the Jew gives the world no peace. As long as the world knows not God, the world will never be able to make peace with the Jews. And there's a new book, which I mentioned today in a column, but I'll be doing a feature with this called Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Jew? Learning to Love the Lessons of the Jew Hatred. And he has a fantastic Kiddush there. This Rabbi Raphael Shore, Rabbi Raphael Shore, and he's made a movie that's interesting.
Right.
Who understood whose hatred of the Jews was the purest and clearest was Hitler, Yamach Shemo. That he understood that the Jew was the antithesis of what he thought the world needed, which was social Darwinism, that through struggle humanity reaches its peak. You know, he said the Jews inflicted two wounds on humanity, morality and Brit Milah. And that morality, humaneness, all these things which the Jews brought into the world. So there's a lot to be proud about. What they hate us for, and what the greatest hater of all hated us for, was precisely the Torah. That we, just like Chazal say, that Sina is a language of Sinai, came into the world. But to see the awakening of Jews, I've never seen anybody who went out to do kiruv work who didn't make an impact, who didn't have successes, who couldn't. That much I'm optimistic about. On the individual level, we'll find lots of people, and I think mostly in Israel. I think the future, I'm clear to me that the future of the Jewish people is in Israel. And I can't understand how everybody's not clear on that now, but why? Because Israel is the collective existence of the Jewish people. And it forces you, if you're going to be spending 3 years in the army, if you're going to making certain sacrifices, subject yourself to certain dangers. Until very recently, we had 7 enemies bent on our destruction surrounding us, the Iranian ring of fire. Now we've removed a good part of that. I mean, the last year and a half, from a military point of view, from a strategic point of view, the situation of Israel is that much greater. But I'm saying the sacrifices that you make to live here for the collective identity of the Jewish people force you to answer a question: why does it matter if Jews continue to exist as a people? If we're only a gene pool, so the gene pool will remain. But why is it important that we remain as a people? And I think you can approach Israeli Jews with that question. I think there's a way. I think that it makes them more open to being reached than, American Jews don't think about their being Jewish. No one's telling them they're living in the Jewish state. There's a state which is meant to be the preservation of the collective identity of the Jewish people. So that question isn't thrust upon them. Here it's thrust upon you.
Is this change going to come from above or from below? Is it the leadership is there leadership to lead this, or is it going to come from the ordinary great people of the world?
I have written on this topic. Just before I started writing the Rav Yaakov book, the last piece I wrote for Yated Ne'eman, of which I was the English Yated Ne'eman, of which I was the first editor for its first 2 years, was called "Are Gadol Biographies Good for Us?" And there I argued that one of the problems with Gadol biographies is they make it seem as if Jewish history is entirely an outgrowth of a few great leaders, and that everything came from the top down. And that's obviously not true. I mean, the Rav Noach Weinberg book begins with a speech he once gave, quoting one of the Hebron Rosh Hashivas, who said the most important person in the 20th century Jewry wasn't any of your fathers. It wasn't even Rav Chaim Ozer Grushinsky. It was a seamstress named Sarah Sherer, who started a movement with, pretty much by herself. I mean, it wouldn't have taken off had she not gotten the support ultimately of the Ger Rebbe and others. But it started, she took the initiative. There's a lot of initiatives that are coming from below. There's a lot of work. One of my daughter-in-laws participates in a book in a group out in Ramat Beit Shemesh near you, of women who get together every week to prepare hundreds and hundreds of meals for soldiers and then to bring them to them still piping hot. I mean, gourmet looking meals. There are a lot of things that we can do individually, and the pendulum doesn't swing only from the top. As I always tell people, they say, trends that can't continue forever won't. Famous principle in economics, and a lot of things are more from the bottom than from the top. They need direction, they need shaping, they have a stream moving in a certain direction, but it's not only the leadership. That's a myth. And the problem, if we write Jewish history only in the form of Gadol biographies, is that we miss a lot of that, and it's something that I do worry about. That's why I include a lot of history in those biographies.
In conclusion, on a personal note, what's next in terms of perhaps books or other projects that are either coming to fruition or germinating in your mind?
Well, I write a column every week. That's very satisfying.
Great.
Sometimes I used to write 3 columns a week, but I don't have to do that anymore. And what's next? I'm 73 years old. I hope next is a few great-grandchildren as well as grandchildren, but we're always...
Ken Yerbu.
Yeah. And I will tell you, every time somebody asks me now, what book are you working on? It gives me I get a little bit of it does tweak me a little bit, because I don't want to feel like I'm over buttle, that I'm...
I apologize.
But I think adding more chavrusas, to tell you the truth, there are things I can do now. I can even go out to eat with my wife or go on a vacation with my wife, because I've married off my kids. When I was a kid, I wanted to be president of the United States. Finally, I've gotten past those types of ambitions, and I'm trying to, I'd like to know a lot more Torah than I do. I'd like to spend more time learning, but I'm fascinated by what I do. One thing is the Mishpacha allows me pretty much to read any book I want, and if I can get the guy to submit to an interview, whether it's Yuval Levin, who's written on the American Constitution, or Oren Cass, who's written about developing workers in America, or Walter Russell Mead, who's written on the relationship between Christians and Jews and how it affects the American-Israeli relationship. I like to read a lot, and I spend a lot of time reading and try to bring ideas that won't be so familiar to many of the people who are reading Mishpacha, who are still in a stage in life where they're more focused, or, I suffer from a certain amount of ADD, so I never been very good at setting a life plan or even a daily schedule and saying exactly what it will be. But I'm only looking forward to everything yet to come. Some people have approached me about writing this book or that book, but I don't feel I have to. I've done that. Rav Moshe Shapiro would have been the great project in my life because he was a mentor too. But on the other hand, it would have been such an intense project, and years, the number of people to interview. And because of my own feeling, there's a picture of him on my wall serving as a sandik for one of my kids, and to have his eyes looking at you and knowing that he would have knowing for sure that he would have disapproved of the very idea of the book and probably your execution as well, was probably more than I could have handled. So but I do like learning about people and still writing the kinds of articles that are in ordinary greatness. I hope there'll be lots more like that too.
Again, ordinary greatness. Urge all our listeners and viewers to go online, local bookstores. It's really a wonderful collection.
Also, Feldheim.
And Feldheim,
Feldheim
absolutely.
online is the easiest
Feldheim
way to get
online as well.
Feldheim
And
Amazon, but Feldheim's probably the best.
yeah, absolutely. And Yonason, Jonathan, thank you so much. You should just continue to go Mechael from strength to strength and whatever the next great endeavor is. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much. Talk to you. Bye bye.